Welcome to the Raising Cinephiles podcast, a show about passing on your love of cinema to the next generation. I'm your host, Jessica Kantor, and I have worked in all facets of the entertainment industry for the last 20 years, and recently became a mom. In this first episode, we speak to Susan Ruskin, the current dean of AFI, on the importance of storytelling, no matter the format. Always remember that myself and guests are speaking from personal experience and not giving parenting advice. Let's go ahead and dive into the episode. Welcome to the Raising Cinephiles podcast. This is your host, Jessica Kantor, and I am here with Susan Ruskin. She is a writer and film producer turned educator, currently the dean and EVP at AFI. And I'm just so excited to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Lovely to see you.
So good to see you. My first question is, what is the first movie you remember watching as a child?
So I just have to preface this for a second, that I grew up in South Africa for the first 13, 14 years of my life. And they had no television in South Africa at that time. So I also lived in a rather small town that didn't have a local movie theater. So I would say maybe it was a church, possibly it was Boy Scout, Girl Scout location, but there was a room that I remember very distinctly with fold-out chairs, and we would have these projectors with 16 millimeter prints, and normally they were years after the film had actually come out in the theaters in the rest of the world. And it would be this really bad kind of, shall we say, slightly worn prints with the color not being, in this case black and white, not being particularly either. But the film that I still remember so distinctly as being my first film was something called Whistle Down the Wind with Haley Mills and Alan Bates. Very strange film to see, and I have no idea how old I was, but I suspect probably around 7, 8. And it affected me so much. And I think in some ways because I identified with Haley Mills, most likely. But this odd story of a grifter, possibly criminal on the loose, showing up in a barn and them believing him to be Jesus was an incredibly moving and effective film for me. And so that's the first one that I distinctly remember going to see.
What did movies mean to you after that? Was it something that you got to see regularly?
So that was like a switch that turned on, and it was like instantaneous, in love with the movies. I had already been in theater since I was probably about 5 years old. And my mother was a director and a theater teacher, so a elocution teacher. And I was already really absorbed in storytelling in live theater and loved going to live theater. And so for me, it was really, those two things were really intertwined. When we went to movies, my parents would take us to Cape Town, to the city, to go see a film. So it was always a production. And normally it was probably a musical of some time. But I think it's that particular movie of Whistle Down the Wind that was so much a performance-based and a girl that I identified with my age. That just was an absolute switch turning on. And from that point on, everything that I did in theater was geared towards movies, that I was planning to go into the movies from that age.
So you knew from watching the movie at that age that it was a career path.
Correct. It was very distinct for me that it was a career path.
Because I loved movies growing up, but it took me until college to realize that I could work in them.
I think it's because of my mother and my father. Frankly, my father was an engineer. My mother was an actress, not really, but when she was young, she was. But when she had the kids, she turned to teaching and to directing. And I think that it was always possible, right? So it was always like the theater was always a choice. And we used to have what was an adjudication of going up and doing poems since I was 5 years old. And you would get these awards for them. And I remember doing a show about black shoes, red shoes, stumped them on the mat shoes, and got the gold award. And that was like the beginning of, okay, this is me. This is who I am. This is where I belong. And so then when watching Whistle Down the Wind and seeing how film is completely immersive and how you can disappear into a world that you don't really know and that you're not connected to, that's when the power of film became so apparent to me that it took already a nascent love of storytelling and put it into a place that I felt could be incredibly effective. I went to college to study theater, and I've directed theater, I've acted in theater, I've done sets, I've done every aspect of theater and now film. But when I was studying theater, I was basically studying it to go to film. I wasn't studying it with the idea that theater was my future.
And did you find that learning kind of mise en scène in theater really helped set you up to be successful in film?
Absolutely. No question. And maybe mostly in the ability to communicate effectively and not be terrified, even though I still am when I'm on stage. Really understanding that to make films, you have to be a great communicator as well. You can be really excellent at most of the functions or some of the functions and be fairly antisocial and not have to get up and pitch or an idea. But if you're a writer or a director or a producer or honestly even a cinematographer or any of the heads of departments, you really do need to communicate what you're doing effectively. And I think theater gave me that. It also gave me the ability to just get it done. Just go into the garage, write something, make it happen. And then growing up, we did a lot of that. Like we did a lot of playmaking. So yes, I think theater helped me enormously in all those aspects to become a producer.
And so you said you moved away from Cape Town at, you said?
13, 14, yeah, to Newton, Massachusetts.
Okay, that's a big difference.
A very big difference, yes.
And your access to content, I'm sure, shifted then. And I'm curious what your viewing habits turned to.
I was so taken with TV at that point that I have to be honest with you. I was like, what the hell is this? And it was just present you could turn it on anytime. You didn't have to drive into Cape Town to go see a movie. So ultimately, I'm sure I came home that first year from school every single day and probably turned on whatever was on. So I just remember like the Big Valley, and I remember soap operas, but I can't say they had much of a positive impact on my love of film, but that was like the sort of introduction to mass moving images that I was really quite taken by.
Did you find as a teenager that you went to the movies with friends?
Yes. So then movies became what I think, unfortunately, we may have lost some of that. I was going to jazz music or to theater or to movies, and they all had the same kind of experience for me, which is you go with friends, you go to talk about the film, you go to watch something new that's coming out, you go to get to know who the new filmmakers and storytellers are. But I have to say, I think that it was in college. I went to Sarah Lawrence and I went there for the theater program, specifically for the theater program. But I also took film courses and I took a number of film appreciation courses. And I realized in those film appreciation courses that my love of French and German cinema was really born during those times because, again, we're not talking about a lot of access in the 80s to get these movies. So you really did have to go to a class to do that. My second job was at Paramount working for Robert Stigwood, and I had the beauty of having his office on the Paramount lot. And because they had tons and tons of prints and because they had all these theaters available with projectionists, I was allowed to call up any movie I wanted to go and watch them to see if they were potential for remake. So I definitely took advantage of that. In the same way I took advantage of the classes that we had at Sarah Lawrence to watch movies. And then I spent a fair amount of time in Europe going to the theaters in Paris and watching French and German cinema there. It's interesting because when somebody asks me, what's your favorite movie today? I don't answer. I do answer, but I give an answer that's a non-answer. And I will say it's Woman in the Dunes.
Okay.
And Woman in the Dunes, I probably saw at Sarah Lawrence. I think it was probably introduced to me at that point. I don't even remember exactly. But I do remember being incredibly affected by the film. And I think it's brilliant. I think it is ripe for a remake. And I've been thinking about it for as long as I've seen that movie since I was in college. And I think it has elements of what I think is so relevant in storytelling. And actually, when I was thinking about the fact that we were going to do this, I was trying to recollect what are the films that I really love or that really have affected me. And I won't name because I hate that, but I'll name films that are, I think, incredibly effective. So I have a grandson now. So my thinking about what I would show him and what I did for my kids. So for my own children, the first thing that we ever watched were Nature Channel, National Geographic, nature-oriented movies. So the animal behavior type of movies. And I think Woman in the Dunes is part of that whole cultural identification between man and nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably thematically something I've been interested in my whole life, but haven't necessarily fully identified until you start thinking about what are the things that you really like to watch or what are the movies that really move you.
How did you start to identify your taste?
This is a question I ask or I speak about fairly regularly as an educator now. It's you don't always know what it is that your voice is or what that your theme really is in your life of what keeps attracting you to stories. I do now know, but I did not know for the longest of times. And I think that's really natural. And normally it's when you look back that you start to see the same sort of thematic ideas that keep coming up in your life and you realize where you're naturally just attracted to certain kinds of stories. And I think the process for me was reading, becoming an executive in the film business and producing. You just read thousands of screenplays. So I have probably read thousands and thousands of screenplays. And I like all kinds of different genres. I really do. And I don't mind writing all kinds of different genres or watching all kinds of different genres. And sometimes those two don't actually match. What I like to write and what I like to watch don't always match. But I do think that there's thematically ends up being a through line to what we do, both in what we watch or what we choose to watch, what we write, what we end up focusing on. And that happens whenever you reflect back. I think it doesn't necessarily happen by sitting down and saying, now I'm going to figure out what my theme is or what my style is, because I think it evolves. It changes and evolves. But most of the time when there's a voice, and most of the time hearing that voice for many people doesn't happen. Wes Anderson is Wes Anderson. He's not going to change. Like you see an image and you know it's Wes Anderson. The way he divides the frame, you just know it right away. Mm-hmm. But I think for most filmmakers and storytellers and writers and producers especially, I think it can shift depending on the project and the material and the team.
When I invited you on this show and you wrote back that you were excited for the conversation, you were very specific in the language you used, and you said storytelling was very important to pass on to my children. So I wanted to just touch on that of specifically the word storytelling and ask you why that is so important.
I think that moving images are not just movies the way we think movies are defined. And I also think our definition of what is a movie is shifting right under us. So the word storytelling encompasses all different kinds of ways of building a world, creating a narrative. And I don't think they have to be so different in terms of their effect, but they may be different in terms of how they deliver it. And you know this because we've had some of these conversations before. Like there's a way that we pigeonhole. The Academy Awards, the Oscars are movies. What does that mean? Is it something that's just 2 hours long that has to be in a theater? And to me, that definition has loosened significantly, because a great story is just as much something that you might watch, at home, that you're streaming, that you might binge at 9 episodes of it, or you might watch one at a time, or you might watch when it comes out every Sunday, whatever it might be. That's equally as engaging a story and equally as powerful a culture-changing way of having us see the world differently. It's, to me, movies are culture, or storytelling is culture, and it affects culture. Mm-hmm. So turning somebody into a movie lover really is, or raising a cinephile, as you put it, a cinephile can be defined in any way, shape, or form. Cinephile can be something that you watch on TV.
One of the themes that's starting to emerge from these conversations is actually how important, especially with children, the conversations you have after watching content in general or a story, and how it's sometimes, so far, almost everyone has been happy to and okay with showing their children stories that are more mature for where they're at, in order to have a conversation that is easier to have outside of themselves.
So I'm incredibly guilty of that, to the point where I sometimes wonder if I traumatize my son. He is a cinephile, there's no question about that, and a passionate cinephile too. His taste is often interesting to me. I think he has great taste anyway, but he doesn't even fully remember this, but I know that the first movie I showed him was Benji the Hunter. The first movies I showed him, as I have with my grandchild, is animal documentaries. That's always where, for me, I've always begun, because I think that it's captivating, it's exciting, it's interesting, it's learning about other creatures. And my grandson now just does the elephant sound of when he sees me, because he wants me to show him an elephant documentary. And it's so lovely to see that engagement. And I think that's bite-sized, easy engagement with younger kids. But I started showing my son Hunted, which, came out in 87. He was born in 1988. So probably he was a couple of years old. I don't think he was very old when I started showing it to him. And it is heartbreaking. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it is heartbreaking. And it's like watching this dog who gets lost trying to make his way home, Benji. And my son used to sit there and bawl his eyes out. And I was thinking to myself, what am I doing to him? This is so cruel. But it was cathartic for him. And we would talk about it afterwards. And he loves dogs. He still loves dogs. And I think maybe that connection happened in some senses with this identifying of this lost dog finding his way home. Terrible movie. I'm not recommending it as a film necessarily, but that's an example of showing something that probably he was way too young to watch. But I know it helped him to think through, because he was a pretty heavy thinker at a very young age. He was very philosophical. And I just helped him to deal with some of the issues around fear of things and loss and things like that.
Yeah, that's using cinema. I don't know what really drew me so much in high school, especially. I would say middle school and high school to films in general. I know it was very social to go to movies when I was in middle school with my friends. And then in high school, I started to love filmmakers. And I lived in New York City, so I go to Lincoln Square and I got exposed to a lot of beautiful filmmakers. And I still don't really know, and I'm probably searching for that in this podcast a little bit, of like, why do I love movies so much? But I am really interested in how they do so much more than entertainment, and learning about why certain movies should be in theaters and why they shouldn't necessarily be tentpole films. But they're the films that we really need to be seeing as a collective in the world and not alone in front of a television.
Do you remember the most effective movie for you at that age of what you were watching at a place like Lincoln Center, for example?
I saw so many movies. I remember when I was like in 9th grade, I saw Pulp Fiction.
Right.
I saw Clueless in the theater at Lincoln's, not the indie theater, the other theater. I remember seeing The Matrix. Right. I remember going with my friends and sneaking in beers to see The Matrix.
Of course,
like beers with straws, probably 40s, but like real New York City kids.
So I was an executive at the time when that movie came out and had read the script and tried to bid on it to get it. And I have to tell you, the first 50 pages of that script was one of the most exciting scripts I had ever read. Wasn't entirely sure what was going to happen with the rest of the movie, but they did amazingly well with it. The Wachowskis really knew what they were doing.
The movie I remember seeing, I saw it on TV in my house, that really, I think, changed my idea of cinema, was Stealing Beauty, Bertolucci's film with Liv Tyler. Yeah. Liv Tyler was playing someone about my age in it, going to Italy, discovering her family and losing her virginity. And I think it was a lot of where I was in my age and the feelings between the different boys. And it was also, the soundtrack was beautiful and artful. And so that film really affected me.
Yeah, I think it is. I think people do connect to movies that they identify with. And I actually asked my son this morning, because the first movie I remember taking him to the theater to was Lion King. Mm-hmm. And I remember him and his sister being terrified because the sound was so loud and the screen was so big. And they were it just freaked them out. I think the full effect of it was freaking them out. But he mentioned his memories were around Hercules and Yellow Submarine and The Hobbit and things like that, Lord of the Rings, those kinds of things. And we had shown him, and we have since shown his son, my grandson, a short animated film called Rarg. And I don't know, somebody must have sent it to me as a potential for working with the creator, with the animator, because I had it on DVD for whatever reason in my house. It got put on a regular basis. And it is this very sweet British animated film about a whole world being inside somebody's dream, of them trying to keep the dream going. And it's so beautiful. And I watched it with my grandson the other day, showed it to him, and it still holds up. it's just so interesting when a story is well told. It defies, most of the time, not all the time, but it lasts for generations. And I think when you think about what's the movie that deserves to be in the theater, that should be watched as a collective, it's the ones that are going to last for generations. And there are less of them than we think. And there are also tons of them because movies have been around for 120 years. And there are some outstanding films out there that, we should be watching again and again and again.
As you're thinking through what you're going to show your grandson and what you showed your son, do you and your son agree?
We have very similar taste usually. If I tell him to watch something, he probably will watch it and vice versa. Like I think we do, not always, but in general, I think we share taste. My daughter, not as much, but she's very much more distinctly anime and more of maybe the Harry Potter generation that is very clearly the Harry Potter generation. But I would say to you, for example, Spirited Away is something that all of us, every single one of us probably thinks one of the greatest movies, right? So all four of us. But yeah, I think that our taste is, I see where he gets his taste, even if it might differ.
Talk about introducing your daughter to film.
Lion King, I think, was the introduction for her. She was probably the one that was most afraid that I had to walk out of the theater to take her out because it was just so loud. And by the way, they both remember the Egyptian. So they both remember the performance beforehand, and this is in Los Angeles, the performance beforehand, the pomp and circumstance of it. And I had taken them to quite a few, and usually it was tame films, but quite a few premieres, like whether they were at the Disney lots, it was like going to Disney. So I think there was a fair amount of pomp and circumstance around going to movies with them or taking them to movies. By the way, let me just say, neither one of them want anything to do with the movie business. So it didn't inspire that kind of love, but they were inspired to read and to write and to be engaged with storytelling in lots of different ways, both of them. So my daughter doesn't go to movies as much, doesn't quite care as much in the same way, but she's a reader. Like she's a big reader, as is my son, and I think she loves television. So
that's been another conversation of my friends that have two children. It's very different for each child.
Yeah, they are different. They connect on certain things, but they're different in their taste. But they respect one another's taste. They're not cruel to one another about it. My son can't watch horror movies, and my daughter might tease him every now and then about it, but she doesn't make him feel bad about it.
So when did you ever show your kids horror films or anything in that range?
I was actually trying to think about that, and no, I'm not a lover of horror films myself. I love thinking about what makes a good horror film. Like I really love that aspect of it. Like I would produce a horror film in a minute. I don't know that I'd want to watch them quite as quickly as I'd want to produce them, but making movies is fun if the right team of people comes together and you're doing it for the right reasons. And I made a horror comedy. I made a film that is a big creature film with a very clear tongue in our cheek. But we had the best time making that film because we were on a ride and we very intentionally wanted to take the audience on a ride. And for me, that's a horror film. It's like horror films take an audience on a ride. Mm. And if you can, even though the film I did was not a horror film, but it was, some people probably think it was, but it wasn't intended to be horror. But it was really about having fun being scared, not being horrified, but having fun being scared. And horror movies have lost, when they became more about the gore, it lost that for me. So I tend to just stay away from them now, though Get Out was brilliant.
Get Out was brilliant. I do feel like horror has split into its own subgenres because there's like comedy horror, which is a little bit more in that range of what you're talking about. And What We Do in the Shadows, it's a comedy, but it's a horror comedy. Some of Edgar Wright's stuff, I think, was like horror comedy. But then there's the Halloweens and the gores and those things. But then Scream to me is a fun ride.
It is, but that was so interesting about Scream. And I think it's because I didn't fully get it. I think I read that script too, and I didn't get the humor in the script. I understood it was supposed to be funny, but I think it's because I wasn't a horror fan. I think you have to be a fan to have really appreciated the humor. I did appreciate it more when it was up on the screen. I was like, oh yeah, all right, that was the intention, got it. But it's just not my go-to, so I don't know. I'm not good at analyzing it particularly well.
Yeah. I've come to the conclusion that comedy should be in a theater.
Yes, because things are much funnier when there are other people around you laughing, intentional, unintentional. But humor, I think, really does need an audience. I think it plays much better. I'm trying to think of what's the last funny comedy that I've seen.
Mine was Schitt's Creek for me, which is TV.
Yeah.
Yeah. Laughed out loud on that. And then there was that HBO show, I want to say Searching, but it wasn't.
Oh, yeah, yes, I do remember that. But Hacks is really funny. Have you seen? I was very impressed with the humor on that one. I went into that one going, nah. And then I found myself getting sucked into it. So there's the beauty of television versus going to a theater. I would never have gone to see Hacks in a theater, ever.
Mhm.
Wouldn't have walked into that, wouldn't have cared. And yet, because it was easily available and right there and didn't take an enormous amount of time, I watched one episode, liked it just enough, tried it a second time, probably heard from somebody else that they loved the third episode, and then went in and really got hooked.
Yeah, I liked Hacks a lot, though it didn't make me laugh out loud very much. But I was same with Ted Lasso. Like there'll be moments where I'll giggle, but it feels good to watch it.
But why is there so much good comedy on TV now and not necessarily in the theater? Don't Look Up. Maybe that's not supposed to be a comedy, and it's not hilarious because it's goddamn scary, but it was hilarious. I did think it was incredibly funny. He's brilliant at doing that, McKay. Just brilliant.
It was very meta for me, that one.
It is very meta.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to transition us to the last little phase, which is what are some I typically ask the question, what is the film I should show my son to have him love cinema? But I'm going to alter it for you just a little bit and say, what are some of the tactics as he grows and gets older to keep him involved in storytelling?
So you're going to recognize pretty quickly what he responds to. And I would just say, watch that. And every time it generates any kind of conversation or any kind of further discussion, I would watch more of it. There's a movie called Gods Must Be Crazy. Amy Ace. This is South African, right? So I have more of a connection to this. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to anyone. But that's the kind of beautiful, funny, heartwarming, out of this world story. So for me, encouraging your children, your child, to see something that takes them out of what they know and understand, which is why I think I'm attracted to showing my kids National Geographic and animal shows or travel shows. It takes them outside of what they see every single day. Anything that absorbs them into a culture, like even Anthony Bourdain's cooking shows of traveling all over the world, and particularly the last one that he did where he had amazing cinematographers and directors making them. So if you were in Italy, you felt like you were in an old Italian movie. If you were in Japan, you felt like it was a Japanese film. Okay, I think anything that challenges somebody to have a conversation with the screen, and you will recognize what it is with your kids. And for me, it's adventure, humor, and pathos, like really touching the heart. And we didn't talk about sad movies, but I think sad movies are really good things for kids to watch because it helps them deal with their own sadness.
One of my early conversations talked about how Disney movies are somewhat problematic because there's always a lot of death in them.
So it's always the mother, right, that dies, which is terrible.
But it's also interesting to process the fear of losing a parent. And I do think like the kid's journey out of the house is individuating from their mom more even. Right. And so that is probably a lot of where that stems from.
I think the reason why I really loved The Lion King, because my kids were at the age where it was right for them to be seeing it. So that may have something to do with it. But that really did deal with loss. In this case, it was not the mother, thank goodness. I was sick of all the mothers dying. But it was also of finding your own voice and discovery and love and community and nature. And I think it's almost a perfect movie, the animated film, in some weird way for a child. I think it really was so well thought out and written. And I know my kids were really heartbroken and it was sad, but they thoroughly went on the ride with that movie. And if you can thoroughly go on the ride, I think that's what really matters.
That's actually, Lion King is my first movie memory in the theater. It was like right before I went away to summer camp. And I got to experience an adventure of my own. I lived in Fort Myers at the time, and so we had to cross to Fort Lauderdale so I could fly with the small group that was going to the Northeast from Florida. And I was super nervous to go to camp. And that night, my mom took me to see The Lion King before I flew out the next day. And so I just remember just feeling so comforted in the theater.
Yeah, it made you braver, I'm sure, to go on that journey. Were you sad in the movie? Did it upset you?
I remember I love feelings in general. I love to feel things pretty much. I'm the person who watched Grey's Anatomy every Thursday to cry just because I needed a good cry. So I probably did. I don't remember distinctly sadness or tears, but I distinctly remember the Hakuna Matata song. I like the chills of the music. And I think I had my mom send me the soundtrack or something because it's really stuck with me. And then I remember going to see it on Broadway also.
Yeah. I didn't love the play, I have to say. The musical did not quite do it for us, but I get it. The music is great. I play the music to my grandson now.
I've done it for my son. He's not as to it as I was hoping. I do play, for some reason, my mom mentioned Popeye the Sailor Man, which is such a problematic cartoon. But we listened to the music a little bit, and then this playlist comes up of retro TV music and movie titles. So like The Muppet Show, and it's this great, very orchestrated music. And he loves listening to that with me and dancing to it. And we dance a lot in the living room. And he loves books, so we do a lot of story time with books. I've been able to read Goodnight Moon, Where the Wild Things Are.
So Goodnight Moon, that's the one. It's the one that gets them all. I think when my grandson was first born, I read that to him. I'm still reading it to him. So.
Yeah, he always just loves the stories. My mom does make-believe stories with him a lot, and you can see him go through the emotional journey.
So there you go. We're back to full circle here. Mm-hmm. It's the emotional journey in going, no matter what the story is, somebody's spoken word, if it's moving image, if it's in a book, but the love of movies comes from the immersion for me. Then when you talk about a cinephile, it's that immersion in a different world, in a different culture, and going through the journey with whoever the protagonist is that you really are. You're connecting to something different from yourself.
My last question, if I were to be able for his 4th birthday, rent out a theater and put any movie that existed on the screen, what movie should it be? And your grandson will be invited.
So I would say I got 2 on this one, and one in honor of my son, which would be Yellow Submarine, and one in honor of my daughter, which would be Spirited Away. I think that to choose between those two, I don't know, couldn't. But I think those are such delightful, experiential films, different eras, different ways of seeing, but also really exciting adventures to go on. And in a big theater, that is an experience, right? So anything that really feels like an experience would be the way to go.
Susan, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
A pleasure. So lovely that you're doing this and even thinking about this, because these are important questions.
Thank you. If you enjoyed the conversation, please don't forget to like and subscribe. New episodes release every Wednesday. And leave a comment and let me know which movie you think I should show my son. Until next time, take care.